Okay, very well. And maybe I will slip in a brag as well. A brag for Andy Skarzynski, our new superintendent, for being willing to accept the leadership role in the system under such a challenging time. And the brag is that he's really done stellar work and shown that he's up to the task and just getting warmed up. So we're really happy to have Andy as our superintendent. So let me give you a brief bio, and then Andy's going to brief us on the efforts underway to open schools. Our teachers are back today, and our students are coming back, many of them, on September 8th. And Andy will give us kind of an overview of what we're doing to prepare for that. So a little bit about Andy. He's our new superintendent for the Wyndham Southeast Supervisory Union. He's started his teaching career as a social studies teacher at Littleton Academy in Littleton, Colorado in 1996. He entered school administration in 2004 and has served as an assistant principal, and now a superintendent. He most recently worked as the principal of the Rutland Intermediate School in Rutland City Public Schools. He's earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Anthropology from the University of Connecticut and his Master's of Arts in Education from St. Joseph's College in West Hartford, Connecticut, as well as his Certificate of Advanced Studies and Superintendent's License from the Central Connecticut State University. So I'm really pleased Andy accepted our invitation to give us an overview of where we're at in the public schools here for Brattleboro area. So it's all yours, Andy.
Great, thank you, Frank. I do have to say it has been an incredible transition to work with so many talented people. You know, I feel like I walk into an administration standing on the shoulders of giants and all the people that were before me that helped assemble this fantastic team of people. So I'm thrilled to be here today to share some of the work that we've done. As Frank said, you know, we typically my intention was to hit the ground learning as of July 1st to kind of get a sense of the community, the district, and all the schools. And unfortunately, we've had to hit the ground running with the reopening efforts and a pandemic taking place. So I'll share my screen right now. I put together a quick presentation, and then we'll allow some time for questions too. So the big piece of information is that September 8th, 2020 is the first day of school, and I share that because it's been this target that we've had. The original start of school date was the 31st of August, and we had to adjust that timing a little bit once the governor made his executive order around delaying the start of school. But that's kind of it's a bogey for us. It's the time period that we've been focusing on. And so when we started developing a reopening plan, we had some key organizational beliefs that we wanted to really make sure that we were following. One is that the plan had to be designed for safety for all the building occupants, and that was the primary driver behind the work. We created the plan in a way that it was an all hands on deck approach in both the design and the instruction of the plan. We wanted to be flexible, and so we had to remain open to design and redesign processes. We had to be adaptable. That meant being nimble and adjusting to ever-changing conditions and circumstances. And we also wanted to remain remote ready. And this idea of remote readiness is, what do we do in anticipation of a potential second closure, or if a school has to go remote for a few days or a longer period of time? What are those skills and competencies we have to make sure that everyone has, both students and teachers, so that this remote time period is the most effective? So some key dates, and I share these because this helps shape our work. So as I said, September 8th is, and I set these up backwards so you get a sense of where things have occurred, and it gives you a sense of what's taken place. So September 8th, as I said, is our first day of school. Today is our first day with staff. And so for most of the summer, staff have been helping out. But today is the day that school year staff return to their buildings. Many of them haven't been in the building since the closure March 13th. And so this was a day that many people approached with some degree of excitement, enthusiasm, and probably equal degrees of anxiety and concern. July 15th was a critical date for us. And that was the date that the Agency of Education released guidance related to remote learning. And I put that date in there because that was one of the pieces of guidance that we were waiting for. So the tricky part with the Agency of Education is that we receive guidance and we'll receive new guidance that sometimes contradicts the old guidance, and we have to make the best with it. But one of the components of information we were looking for was, how do we establish a safe space for students and employees that may be vulnerable and can't come into the school because of health conditions or loved ones that have health conditions? And that was the critical date that really shifted much of our work. So I officially started July 1st. And so as I've counted the days, I'm still under 60 days in the district. But prior to that, we did a day where it was called Building Math. And the purpose of that time frame was to really examine what is the guidance telling us around the buildings, the room sizes, and how many students we could have in a room with a teacher, using a 6 foot separation between students. And so the building principals literally sat and they measured their rooms, and we looked at how many students could fit into a classroom, and then brainstormed around those items. And then going back up to June 15th, that was the date that the Agency of Education released their guidance around what were the things that we need to do and do to reopen schools. So kind of gives you a snapshot of the work, starting the really ramp up time where we started to have a sense of what do we need to do and what is this going to look like in anticipation of opening, really began mid-June. So some critical questions that we've asked ourselves, and these are things that have guided much of the work as well, is what are students' needs going to be? Given that students haven't been in school, by the time they come back to us September 8th, it'll be almost 6 months since they've actually been in a physical school building. So one, what are our students' needs? How is that going to present when they return? And is this an academic need? Is it a social need? Is it a mental health need? Is it an emotional need? But really, what is that going to present like when students arrive, as well as when staff arrive? How did the spring impact student trauma and stress? We know that some of our students have, and what we know about trauma and adverse childhood experiences for children, those are the things that really have long-term health impacts and implications for a child's, not just their learning ability, but for their physical health as well. And so we wanted to ask ourselves, how did that spring impact that level of stress that students may have had, and how's it going to manifest itself on our kids? So what we also know with children that have been impacted by adverse childhood experiences is a sense of community goes a long way in addressing many of those worries. And so when we think about that level of stress and how students may be feeling that level of anxiety, we want to make sure that we're creating a solid foundation. And so the next question we really asked ourselves is, how do we rebuild a sense of belonging, community, and connection after really having been out of school for so long? And it's not just connection to school, but it's that stability that many of our students need within their lives, especially our most vulnerable population. And then what needs to be in place for people to just feel safe? And this means it's for our faculty members as well. And so when I visited a few buildings today, you can see those things in the building where the directions are clear and everywhere. There's ample amounts of PPE around the building. There's ample amounts of sanitizer and clear directions where people are going and they're supposed to be. There are room occupancy signs on all the classrooms. But these are some of the measures and some of the real foundational pieces that had to be put into place for people to just feel safe. So how do we build collective understanding around the needs of our students and staff? And this is one of the ones on the surface, it seems like a simple question, but we want to make sure that we are alerting ourselves to the fact that many of our students are going to present their needs in different ways. And the greatest thing that we can do with our kids is to pause and not just react. And then the biggest question is, how do we get all this work done? And that's the part where we had an incredible team of people. And again, having people like Frank in the office to help provide information and guidance around the key statutory items and the budgeting piece has been incredible. So our reopening framework, in terms of designing this, and this work really kind of came into clarity after that July 15th date when we had the opportunity to provide a level of remote instruction for students. So the first bullet around starting slowly and cautiously, that's been in place since we started working on our plan. We provided parents and students a choice whether they wanted to attend school in person or do remote learning. We wanted that choice to extend up through at least the first semester, and that would allow the schools to do the staffing planning and the staffing architecture to meet those classroom needs. So for families that chose in-person learning, that involves 2 days for students in grades K through 8, it involves 2 days of instruction, and those groups are clustered in a Monday and Tuesday or a Thursday, Friday cohort. The reason for that is we wanted students to be together for 2 days of contiguous learning, and as opposed to kind of a Monday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Friday, it also allowed the building a chance to, if there wasn't as much, it didn't really require the deep clean between Monday and Tuesday if there were different cohorts coming in. And students in 9th through 12th grade, they will initially be in 1 day per week with the opportunity to have an additional day for supports as necessary. And Wednesdays as a district, we are fully remote for all students, whether in person or remote. The students that chose remote learning, it is 5 days a week of remote instruction, and it's what we'd call both synchronous, which means live instruction that may involve a teacher on the screen delivering content and material right, as they're speaking with a variety of different tools, or it could be asynchronous. And this is, when we say asynchronous, it means it could be independent work, it could be a recorded message or conversation that a teacher is doing. It may be an app or a platform that they're working with. But it's a balance between both that live instruction and kind of offline instruction. And we built the timing for those for the remote days really around those best recommendations. And so for some of our younger students, it's really only a couple hours of screen time per day, with also breaks built in for physical movement and exercise and activity, as well as things like reading and doing something outdoors. So some of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges that we found is that we had to figure out different ways to say the word unprecedented. And I literally had Barb Nowakowski, my assistant, I said, Barb, I need a different word for unprecedented. And Barb, true to form, created a list of about 10 different words I could use that I have tacked up next to my desk because I felt that we were saying the word unprecedented so frequently. But in all seriousness, some of the big challenges we looked at, safety for one. How we're making sure that everyone is safe, and what does safety look like for different people. We wanted to make sure that we were addressing the changing guidance and changes to the new guidance. And we received the information, for instance, about remote learning 1 week, and then we received additional information about policy actions that needed to be taken with remote learning, and then the information the following week that reversed the directive about policy action about the remote learning. So having that ability to have a degree of flexibility with it was really critical. We had to identify action steps based upon this new information. And so what does it look like for remote learning? When you didn't know before July 15th that we could do it, how do we ramp up something quickly? In terms of meeting the needs of vulnerable populations, whether they were students and staff alike, that's something that we've placed a lot of considerable emphasis on, and we're still working on that. And we still don't have the magic cure for it, but we do have a better process in place than we did at the start of the summer. In general, just developing new processes. And so we thought about how do we treat staff if we have an abundance of staff needing remote teaching accommodations because it would be what we call vulnerable to the virus. How do we develop, what processes do we have to develop to deal with the staffing concerns? And then one of the most daunting aspects is really clarifying the regional versus national numbers. Vermont is an incredibly safe state right now in terms of the COVID statistics. And in terms of the community infection rate is incredibly low. Unfortunately, we're awash in this information from nationally, where there are other states that have had difficulties with reopening, that didn't have the thoughtful processes put in place, that didn't have the transparency in government that we've seen. in Vermont, or not necessarily even the support of the government. And some of those numbers, because there are, waves spiking across the country, people just don't feel safe because of much of that. And so making sure that we're doing whatever we can to clarify some of the differences there. And there were really so many more, concerns and challenges that we had to run, we came up against. So how do we address the challenges? So it was a collective effort. And, this is where I've alluded to some of the work of many. We had a central office team that jumped right in on this. We developed 4 action teams that were comprised primarily of leadership, school leadership positions, and then they recruited teachers to serve on those groups, and those were built around health and safety, communications, continuity of learning. So what does the learning look like? And policy and operations. And the policy and operations group got into things like attendance practices and food delivery and cleaning ops. We had a cross-district group of school nurses that met regularly, as well as 2 summer, what we call COVID-19 coordinators that dealt with all the tying the loose ends together. Our special education teachers and our special education team worked as a cohort to make sure that we were addressing the needs of our medically fragile students, as well as those that were academically fragile. Our facilities group met regularly and weekly to make sure that the ventilation, and they met largely with Frank, to make sure that the ventilation requirements met all the necessary standards. Our union, the WSEA, met regularly. And then school leadership councils also met. And so throughout all of this, we had over 150 unique individuals contributing to the reopening of schools in some ways. And so it really captures, and this is in addition to all the community forums and the parent groups that we conducted. It was really, stellar. So in terms of where we wanted to get staff input, we received input, from staff through forums on Zoom. We looked for their participation through the advisory councils. We held 2 distinct forums, one for the lower group, one for the elementary grades, one for the secondary grades. And then we held a secondary feedback, a secondary forum on our draft plan and that work that was being done. And then I was in constant communication with our union president and executive board. And in terms of families, so my initial introduction to the district was really through 10 or 11 different Zoom meetings, each with each individual school. And those family forums were to receive feedback, gain a sense of what the concerns were. The family forums were incredibly helpful in terms of helping us develop our planning and what communication and what messaging had to go out and what the parents really need to see. And sometimes they were simple things like, what do we need for, can we clarify school supplies, and do I need to buy more markers for my child because we don't have the community bin of markers at our desks? And some were more significant around how are we going to communicate work, and how we're going to communicate expectations in attendance, and what do we do if there's a positive test case and we have to worry about those things. So families were surveyed at this district level as well as the school level, and parents participate regularly on our each school's leadership advisory council. So the safety aspect, and I won't go through this whole list, but this is kind of an indication of our health and safety team made sure that they were out in front of things early to order things like hand sanitizer and spray bottles and masks and the facial coverings and the cloth, whether it was a disposable mask or a cloth face covering. This group was out in front of things to make sure that all those items were in place so that when people do go in, there's no question. We were looking at an increased use of little things that you would think would be simple to get, infrared thermometers, because we have to screen students when they come to school. Those were purchases that had to be made, and they had to be made early in the summer, and we were fortunate to have this team pull all this work together. So in terms of a day to a student, we think about what does this look like for kids. The day itself was designed for safety and a phased reopening. And so when we started to look at the numbers and when students are coming in, we wanted to make sure that the time that we allowed us a slow start. Instead of bringing all the students back at once, we wanted to bring them in slowly to make sure that we were all practiced and rehearsed in our action steps that have to be taken, because the day will look differently. Students will have one-way hallways, for instance, and timed bathroom periods where they would go. But the overall instructional aspect is this purposeful use of time on building community and making sure that everyone feels safe, both from an academic and emotional and mental health standpoint. So when we say we're looking at different steps, step 2, according to the Agency of Education, is the most restrictive in-person setting that is recommended. And that means that students have more physical distancing, masks are worn all the time within the school day. There's minimal movement throughout the building, and there's, students are in line in with one very small group for contact tracing purposes. Once we get to step 3, some of those groups kind of expand a little bit and the connections can broaden. But right now when we open, and it's really at the most restrictive and safest environment for students to come back into the day. So the other half, so we had 589 families elect for remote work. And when we think about the springtime, and so that's, out of, that's a significant number of our population. It's, it's a little over 25% of our kids wanted to do remote work, which is similar to what we're seeing nationally in trends, both across the country and across the region. We want to make sure that we recognize remote work is really being different from the springtime. The springtime, we were in this emergency remote, where all of a sudden we went home on the 13th of March. We thought everything was normal. On a Sunday morning, that changed. And the teaching profession in both the state and the region and the country turned on a dime. And we were into this emergency remote mode, where sometimes students and families were on Zoom at 6 in the morning or at 10 o'clock at night. Well, we recognize the need that everyone thrives in structure and having predictability and a sense of normalcy. So when we looked at what does the remote environment look like for a student, there will be an increased level of structure. There will be definitions to the day. And so the day will start at a distinct time and will end at a distinct time. We're expanding the use of that asynchronous learning. And so there will be some more independent work for students, and there may not necessarily be as much direct teacher instruction, but the teachers will be checking in regularly with students. And for both in-person and remote learning, we want to make sure that we are paying plenty of attention to the increased supports that are necessary for our vulnerable populations, and we're using the knowledge we gained from last spring to help us inform our actions. And so some general questions that we've encountered, and these are things that come up with the Secretary of Education, Dan French. So are we testing everybody? And this is a question that's come up in numerous school board meetings. It's come up in a number of the family meetings. We are not testing everybody. I have 2 college students, and they both had to receive a negative COVID test before going back to school. That was dictated by their college. It wasn't dictated by the Department of Health and the states where they're attending. But at this point, the Department of Health has said that there's really no epidemiological value in testing students or staff in a state with such a low level of community spread. That may change. As we said, some of the guidance does tend to change frequently. The next is everybody required to wear a mask. And yes, everyone within the building is required to wear a mask with few exceptions and exemptions. And those exemptions would be for special education purposes or accommodation purposes under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, or for other factors. So what happens if there's a positive test? And this is one of those questions that every forum we did, this came up. I would be working with the Department of Health to really determine next steps. And, aligned with the next question, will the schools close again? Well, we're remaining in this remote ready mindset, but a positive test doesn't necessarily indicate a multi-week long closure or a multi-month long closure. It may mean that a room in a building could be closed for 24 hours. It may mean the building may be closed for 3 days. It could be closed for 2 weeks. It really depends upon the intensity of the outbreak and the spread and the level of connection between people. And the big kind of, I think Frank could tell us, it's probably the multi-$100,000 question, how much extra is this costing the district? Well, this isn't really costing the district much out of its normal operating budget in terms of what we had anticipated when the budget was created. The CARES Act, Corona Relief Funds, will really cover most of the expenses. And this is where, like I've alluded to, the great team we have around us. It's amazing to have one of the best business managers in the state is on top of the money and on top of knowing where things are right now. To the extent that Frank does, it's really amazing to see. And so really those Corona relief funds will cover most of the increased expenses that we are seeing to reopen schools. So that's our reopening plan. I will stop sharing my screen to see if there are questions in the chat. I think that there were some questions.
Jerry DeBerge, you might have answered it with the overall frequently asked question about cost. You've been able to cover the costs with
Yes, so much of the costs are covered with COVID relief funds. I would look to Frank for the most recent figure, but I think we were between the spring and up to this point, and this is including everything really, we're probably close to, Frank, are we about $750,000 on this so far?
That's right. Yeah, and there's several different types of CARES relief funding that we're pursuing. There's ventilation improvements. There's the PPE and operations. There's a variety of different types of funds. There's even a FEMA component that we're pursuing. We're pursuing them all.
So I noticed a question around about trying. So it's one of the challenges that we face. And so we do have a teaching population, just like our student population, that may be vulnerable. And the Equal Employment Commission has really defined vulnerability as a disability. Now, the impact on a school system means that those students, those individuals, adults, that they're vulnerable to COVID, and those are people really over the age of 65, or people that are autoimmune, that have autoimmune conditions or immune compromised, and a whole other list of health factors. Those are individuals that would require some level of an accommodation to perform an essential life function, which would be work. So our teams really worked incredibly hard. So we had to identify who are those individuals that needed to have a level of accommodation to work remotely. And in looking at that, we had to identify how many classrooms and how many students were opting in for remote work. And one of the incredible things that came out of this was the level of teamwork between especially our elementary schools, where we looked at making coherent class structures, and we teamed up schools, for instance, Green Street School, Oak Grove, and Dummerston Elementary School are joined together for the purposes of creating remote learning opportunities. And so they can assign one teacher per grade level to make a decent sized group that were conducted remotely. And so we were able to do this without hiring additional teachers, but it meant grouping grade levels in a variety of different ways. And so the nice part with it is the teamwork that came out of and the problem solving that we were able to see the principals engage in was pretty incredible. I think Ron, it's a pleasure to meet you. I do have to talk to you at some point.
Hi, Andy. Yeah, I look forward to meeting you too. I've got a $10 brag for Andy. As a former superintendent, I can appreciate the challenge Andy is facing. I hear great things about you and your leadership. I know you're in a great school district, great students, teachers, and staff. And as you've already identified, Barb Nowakowski, so solid, and Frank is amazing. So you're going to do great things. I know our parents and students will really benefit from your leadership. So thank you. Thank you for coming to this district.
No, thank you, Ron. And thank you for leaving me such a deep bench too. You realize there are incredible people in the district
Yeah.
every day.
Thanks.
Thank you. So there's a question around increased childcare hub spots been identified for Brattleboro. So we don't necessarily know about the level of childcare hub spots. That's one of the pressing issues. If you have any ability to reach out to your local representatives and legislators, the need for childcare in this region is extensive, and it's a bit of mission creep from the school, from the day-to-day school operations, to think about like what does childcare look like. But it's where we need the greatest problem. One of the greatest pieces of support within the community is how are we helping families that may have to work and may be struggling economically because their kids are in school for 2 days a week, or their kids may not feel safe going back into the building. And that's a distinct need within the region. So I haven't heard too much more about the increasing of the hub spots for childcare, but it is a distinct need. And so the other kind of pathway, as we look at, as we've had the COVID planning, we've looked at, there's a secondary path that we have to think about simultaneously post-COVID work. One of the key, and probably the top level item within post-COVID work is enacting the district's anti-racism platform that was adopted by the board on July 1st. And part of that anti-racism platform is identifying ways to increase our level of diverse teacher population. And so having a teaching workforce that's more representative of the students that it serves and the families of the community. So we have a diversity committee that I'm going to be asking to help identify kind of some protocols and practices that we can make sure that we're always enacting. And so whether it's an email distribution list, whether it's attending job fairs, whether it's reaching out to universities and colleges that are a little farther away, that we have ways that we can increase the diversity of our staff. Unfortunately, over the summer, we've not made significant inroads in that area, but it's a piece where we know we have to get better. And I'll be asking the diversity committee this week to meet to identify what are the key functions and what are successful districts that are able to create a representative workforce. What are they doing to do that so we can replicate some of those same things?
Andy, let me just ask Marty. Marty, are we on a hard stop at 1 o'clock?
No.
Okay. So I think you've got some more questions there, Andy. If you've got time, if you have time.
So we have a question on how will kids get school breakfast and lunches on remote days. So the buses will be loaded and they'll be similar to the spring where there were designated drop sites around the schools. And the buses will be using transportation as well for those families that can't get. So it'll be a similar practice to what it was. We've listed the different drop sites on our website for families, and we're trying to utilize the district website as a way to provide for more information. And do we need volunteers? We will probably always need volunteers with helping with things like food distribution. I would encourage you to contact, Frank, I'm thinking probably Paul through communications as a person to connect.
Yeah, I think Paul, and I don't think Don Sessions is still our primary contact on that, right? He was over the March, April, May, but I think if you contact central office, if you have suggestions, and as you can imagine, we have to be very careful with volunteers in terms of any sort of interface with our food service operations or any of our operations. As you can imagine, there's a very clear requirement around who can be, who can access school and who cannot under these health and safety rules.
I think that looks like it. Are there other questions? That's looks like it's it, Marty, in the chat section there for questions.
Yes, I think so. I think we've, and thank you very much, Andy, for a really great program for us and updating on the school remote system. And tremendous effort by staff and cooperation as we see the news that some districts across the country are not getting along with the unions. We've done a great job.
Well, thank you. We're blessed to have such an incredible group of educators, from teachers to school administrators to paraprofessionals. Everyone has been focused on the reopening efforts and doing the best work they can for kids. And, I feel incredibly fortunate to be in a district where there's such a level of commitment to education and to making it work. And really from a heartfelt stance, I'm thrilled to be here. So I appreciate the time and it's been a pleasure to meet you all.
And one last note, as Frank and Ron will testify, Rotary is a great place to get away from work. So as you settle in, Frank will be after you for that.
All right. I'm looking forward to that.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Bill? depends on what you're going to say. So,
Well, I'll just tell you this. A few of the Rotarians, the founding Rotarians, recruited me when I was a principal at Leland and Gray, because our student Rotarians would come every month, or, you know, to the programs. And I wanted to check out what these guys were doing, these women and men. And as a result of that, I joined Rotary, and it was a great way for me to make connections in the community. So I would encourage you to think about that. 1 hour a week, 1 hour and 15 minutes a week at lunchtime. It's a nice getaway, and you really get to get a sense of the community.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
and with that, we'll close down the meeting and have a great week. We'll talk to you again. Thank you all.
Thanks, Carl.